The world we live in was shaped by war. For hundreds of years, power-hungry families fought for the right to rule, and Europe transformed.
For the glory of England!
I, Philip de Valois, am the only king of France.
These rivalries shifted borders,
Cursed be the French king!
destroyed cities, and brought populations to their knees. A war of thrones,
Don't touch me!
a tale of murder, sex, and betrayal.
Greatness, madam, that is what France needs.
Those not crowned in glory were brutally slaughtered or condemned to rot in the shadows.
This woman is a heretic and must perish in the flames. Guards! Guards!
In the merciless game of war and ambition, anything goes. In the 14th century, Philip VI, King of France, saw a great new rival emerge. The Plantagenet King of England, Edward III. He intended to seize the crown from his Valois cousin.
Forward!
The rivalry between the two monarchs and their lust for power was to break the bond between France and England for generations. It started the longest and bloodiest war in European history. This became known as the 100 Years' War. On February the 1st, 1328, the 34-year-old Capetian King of France, Charles IV, lay dying. Charles had failed to produce a son and heir, so on his death, the throne of France would be up for grabs. Power-hungry rivals started to circle.
My king.
The Capetian dynasty's only hope lay in the belly of the French king's third wife, Jeanne d'Evreux. She was 7 months pregnant. Charles prayed that Jeanne would give him a son. But until then, he entrusted his first cousin Philip de Valois as regent. Philip was 35 years old, a tall and handsome knight, with a reputation for courage both in tournament and on the battlefield. If the queen gave birth to a son, that child would become king. But if it was a girl, then Philip would become the first Valois king of France. In the spring of 1328, the queen went into labor.
Breathe. Breathe. Breathe.
The whole court held their breath.
Breathe.
At 10 a.m. on April 1st, the much-awaited baby was born. It was a girl. They christened her Blanche. Philip de Valois was immediately summoned to Paris and officially proclaimed Philip VI, King of France.
Stand up, my lords.
Philip now reigned over 16 million subjects and the largest kingdom in Europe. It was the end of the Capetian dynasty and the start of the Valois.
To you, my people, I promise three things: to keep the peace, to stop all pillaging, and to judge fairly.
While Philip VI was enjoying his moment of glory, in England, events were unfolding that would have a dramatic effect on the new King of France. For 3 years, Isabel, the Queen of England, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, had ruled England. Isabel had overthrown her husband Edward II and crowned her son Edward III king. But Mortimer was really in charge. That changed one dark night in October 1330.
Who are you? What do you want? Edward.
Edward hated his mother's lover. He was a cruel and vengeful usurper. He had ordered the murder of Edward's father and was also responsible for the death of his brother. Edward wanted revenge.
Take him.
No. No.
Isabel was an accomplice to all her lover's crimes, but Edward showed her mercy and let her live. Mortimer wasn't so fortunate. On November 30th, 1330, he was executed in the most humiliating way. Not beheaded, as was usual for a nobility, but hanged like a commoner. Edward III was now the undisputed sovereign of England, but he wanted more. The 18-year-old king had his sights set on the crown of France as well. Edward's ambition was founded on the fact that his mother Isabel was a member of the French royal family. She was the sister of the late Capetian king Charles IV. Like him, she was a descendant of the illustrious King St. Louis IX. So Philip VI, the Valois King of France, was her first cousin. But Philip was a member of a younger branch of the Capetian dynasty. Isabel was a direct descendant. When Isabel's brother died in 1328, she sent 2 English diplomats to Paris to demand that the French crown be handed over to her. But the assembly refused. It had long been believed that Isabel wasn't allowed to inherit the French crown because of the Salic law. This law barred inheritance by women in favor of a firstborn male. But no one knew of the law's existence at the time, and it wasn't invoked until much later. The decision to proclaim Philip de Valois king was probably based on politics. Philip was a member of the royal court, and everyone knew him. Isabel was a foreigner, and she was hated in court. Edward thought this was an injustice, and he was determined to put it right, especially as the many territories he already held in France were no longer sufficient. Since the 12th century, English kings had held many valuable territories in the very heart of France: the county of Ponthieu in the north, and the Duchy of Aquitaine in the southwest. But the kings of England governed these territories merely as dukes and not as monarchs. So when it came to swearing loyalty to Philip, the new king of France, Edward refused. He would recognize him as a lord, but not as his sovereign. Philip was incensed by Edward's disrespect. As payback, in 1337 he decided to seize Aquitaine. Philip VI was a great military leader.
Enter.
He led one of the strongest and most aggressive armies on the continent.
We have enough men to surround them. I want them posted here and here.
On the other side, England was a depopulated island with a disastrous military reputation.
The English are weak. Victory is ours. Give the order.
Yes, sire.
For years, the English had been fighting a furious border war with the Scots.
Welcome, my son.
Philip VI chose to support Scotland and its 14-year-old King David II.
Let's talk about the future.
When Edward III heard that Philip VI had offered protection to the King of Scotland and planned to take Aquitaine, he was furious.
Traitor!
This was treachery. Edward sent a letter to the King of France. It was delivered by the Bishop of Lincoln wearing full canonical dress. Faced with such a ceremony, the King of France, who didn't lack a sense of humor, laughed out loud. But when Philip read the letter, the laughter soon stopped. Edward had the audacity to write, "Lord Philip de Valois, who claims to be King of France." Edward was challenging Philip's right to rule.
Tell that to your king from me. I, Philip de Valois, am the only king of France.
Edward declared himself the legitimate heir to the French throne. This was nothing short of a declaration of war. In April 1339, the King of France sent an army to attack the English stronghold of Aquitaine. They seized several towns, such as Saint-Macaire and Blaye. But Bordeaux stood firm. Edward III was at war with the Scots when he found out Philip's offensive in Aquitaine. He swore to retaliate, but the English treasury were empty. He searched for an ally to finance the war. Cities in Flanders answered his call. In January 1340, in Gand, Belgium, Edward unfurled his new coat of arms to his baron. The traditional English lions were now quartered with gold fleur-de-lis on a blue background, the symbol of the French royal family. With this act, Edward was proclaiming himself both King of England and France. Edward's actions were met with an immediate and ferocious response from King Philip. In the former royal abbey of Saint-Denis, Philip summoned his knights together and raised the sacred oriflamme, the standard of the King of France. The message was clear. It was a symbol of French military power and pride, and made it clear that the fight for France would be a fight to the death. War was now on, but it would take 5 years to prepare. July 12, 1346, 750 English ships made landfall at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue in Normandy. The ships transported 15,000 men ready for battle. But before attacking, Edward knighted his 16-year-old son, Prince of Wales. He would later become known as the Black Prince because of the color of his armor. Edward's army then plundered their way through Normandy in an orgy of violence. They left a trail of devastation in their wake. Edward's intention was to show that Philip VI was not capable of protecting his own kingdom. On July 26, 1346, Edward and his men attacked the city of Caen. Over 3 days, 5,000 men, women, and children were massacred. The English stole jewels, clothes, vessels of gold and silver. The English pursued their lust for blood towards the capital, Paris. Two weeks after the English invasion, Philip gathered a vast army at Saint-Denis. Faced with this threat, Edward turned and ran. He headed north for the coastal city of Calais. Despite having the French army at his heels, on August 26th, the weary English stopped here, nearer to the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in the north of France. Philip and some of his army arrived at Crécy during the night. He immediately sent scouts to judge the strength of the English army. The next morning, they reported that the English appeared to have no more than 11,000 men in total.
11,000. Thank you, my lords. Victory is certain. They are 11,000. We are 3 times as many.
Careful, sire. The English are very well organized.
One of Philip's counselors, Henri Lemoine de Bâle, was less confident than his sovereign. He believed that the English had the better position. He advised Philip to wait until morning when the rest of his army had arrived in camp.
You are right.
But in the Middle Ages, controlling an army was a real challenge.
Halt! Reform the lines!
The men in the front received the king's order to stop.
Halt! Halt!
But the men at the back, who couldn't hear the order, continued to march, forcing the front forward until, inevitably, the front line came within range of the English. Philip had lost all hope of holding back his men. He ordered the attack.
Forward! Launch the assault!
The first battle of the 100 Years' War began. 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, hired by Philip, led the attack. But their bolts fell short of the English line. The English archers advanced and fired. A good archer could shoot 20 arrows a minute, with a range of at least 180 meters. A crossbowman could only fire 5 bolts a minute, and their average range was less than 150 meters. In the second line, the king had the cream of French society, eager to fight.
Cavalry! Charge! For the king!
In the third line, the French foot soldiers who managed to survive the English arrows threw themselves into the fray, desperate to spill enemy blood. The battle continued until nightfall. The French army began to fall apart.
Aim! Fire!
Under a rain of arrows, the French soldiers dropped like flies. One of the few to break through the English lines was the blind King of Bohemia. He was so determined to fight, he tied himself to one of his men. Courageous or mad, John of Bohemia died on the field of Crécy. After 16 furious cavalry charges, the French retreated. They had been totally routed. King Philip, who was wounded in the throat by an English arrow, watched his troops run.
Sire, for God's sake, flee. All is lost.
Today, it's difficult to imagine the scale of the disaster that took place at Crécy in August 1346. 1,542 French lords and knights were killed, and more than 10,000 soldiers were massacred by English arrows. The English only lost 2 knights and 80 men. Edward's victory was total. After Crécy, cavalry would never dominate the field of battle as they once had. The era of the archer had arrived. Against all odds, Edward had destroyed Philip's army. But the 100-Year War was far from over, and Edward was still a long way from snatching the crown of France. In 1347, Pope Clement VI condemned Edward for his barbarity in battle. A good Christian, the English king listened, and in September he agreed to a truce. The people of France would no longer live in fear of the marauding English. But little did they know, a far greater killer was on the horizon. In 1348, a plague known as the Black Death swept across France, and a third of the population died. In August, it jumped across the Channel and ravaged Dorset for the next 16 months. When the disease reached London, it killed 40,000 people. Overall, the plague killed around 25 million people across the whole of Europe, nearly half the population. As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, whole villages were abandoned, farmland deserted, and taxes were unpaid. The sudden shortage of money, men, and food made further war impossible. Then, suddenly, on August 22nd, 1350, Philip VI, the first Valois king of France, died. He was 57 years old. The following Thursday, Philip's body was brought here to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of the kings of France. Today, he lies next to his son, King John II. Philip VI died leaving France devastated by war and plague. Historians blame him for having weakened the French monarchy by granting too many privileges in order to finance the war. It's true that Philip made a strategic error at Crécy. But he was a conqueror king who left France far larger than it had ever been. The frontiers of the country now stretched from the foot of the Alps to the powerful city of Montpellier on the Mediterranean. In Paris, Philip also left behind the impressive keep of Vincennes. It was finally completed by his grandson, Charles V. Philip also provided France with a much-needed son and heir, stability in uncertain times. In 1350, Philip's son was crowned King John II. He was 31 years old when he inherited the throne. He was a stubborn but courageous warrior and was nicknamed John the Good. In 1351, he created an order of chivalry called the Order of the Star.
By St. Denis and St. Michael, I do thee knight.
John was convinced that chivalry was the only way to beat the English and seek revenge for his father's failure at Crécy.
Show yourself.
On the other side of the Channel, the Plantagenet Edward III was growing weary and ill. But he still hoped to wear the crown of France one day. He refused to give up, even if at the moment he did not have the strength to lead his own army. He entrusted all military operations to his son, Edward, the Black Prince. The The Black Prince was cruel and ambitious. He also shared his father's appetite for the French crown. In October 1355, the Black Prince, who landed at Bordeaux, left his Aquitaine fiefdom. For the next 2 months, he swept through Languedoc, killing and burning. The Black Prince's tactics were exactly the same as his father. He wanted to terrorize the population and destabilize the new king. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly. Regions of France, pillaged and devastated by the English, took decades to recover from the brutal attacks. In the summer of 1356, the Black Prince and a small band of knights launched a raid towards the center of France. King John quickly secured the bridges over the Loire to stop the English. The Black Prince turned back, with King John in hot pursuit. On September 17th, he caught up with the English army at the gates of Poitiers. Ten years after Crécy, the second great battle of the 100 Years' War was about to begin. The Black Prince was cornered and outnumbered. Desperate to avoid a fight, he promised not to raise an army against the French for 7 years in exchange for a total pardon. But John refused. He wanted to make an example of his English enemy and finished what his father had failed to do. At dawn on September 18th, at Poitiers, the battle lines were drawn. The French outnumbered the English by nearly 2 to 1, and for once, even the formidable archers could do nothing to help. All seemed lost, when suddenly, behind the French lines, an English banner appeared. The Black Prince had ordered a few soldiers to skirt around the French troops and surprise the enemy. The French panicked, and the Black Prince breached the enemy lines. On September 19th, against all odds, King John and his son Philip were surrounded by enemy soldiers.
Look out on your right!
The English were eager to capture the King of France, better alive, but dead if necessary. In the end, King John had no choice but to surrender. After his victory, the Black Prince went to see his prisoners. John the Good and his son were on their guard. But according to the rules of chivalry, the Black Prince, Edward, showed generosity towards his conquered cousins. After fine wine, he served them a meal himself, kneeling as a sign of respect.
The will of God is neither evil nor a cause for remorse. You'll be treated with the greatest regard.
He congratulated John on his bravery. He told him he had fought better than any man on the battlefield.
And even in defeat, you have honored your reputation and the House of France.
But the prince's fine words were of little consolation to the French king. Losing what should have been an easy victory must have been utterly humiliating. The next morning, John and his son were taken to Bordeaux as prisoners. They were surrounded by the booty stolen from the French towns and villages. A few days later, they were put aboard a ship bound for England. May the 24th, 1357, John the Good made his entry into London. He was imprisoned in the Savoy Palace. In France, Charles, the 18-year-old son of John the Good, was quickly named regent. But the inexperienced boy was completely overwhelmed by the pressure of leadership. Not only was his father in an English prison, but France was in the hands of mercenaries, terrorizing and pillaging villages and towns across the kingdom.
You must do something, Charles!
I know! I need to think.
The responsibility was all too much for the Dauphin, Charles. He desperately wanted to bring his father home and restore stability no matter the cost. But to do that, he would have to negotiate with King Edward of England. The English king demanded a ransom of 4 million gold écus and territories in France. He already held Ponthieu and Calais in the north. He now demanded Saintonge, the Limousin, Poitou, Rouergue, and Béarn, the equivalent of a third of the Kingdom of France. Charles agreed to pay the ransom, but refused to concede the territories. It would have terrifying consequences. In October 1359, the Black Prince once again set foot on French soil. And with him, 30,000 troops. The prince's objective was to show his strength and prove how weak the French monarchy was. The ferocious attack would culminate in his coronation as King of France at Reims Cathedral, the traditional place of consecration. But Edward would never enter the cathedral because the citizens of Reims refused to open the gates of the city. So he changed course and set off for the capital. But Edward's army was too weak to take Paris by force, so he laid siege in the hope of forcing the Dauphin to surrender. But Charles held firm, and Edward was forced to negotiate a peace agreement. On May 1st, 1359, negotiations began in the little hamlet of Bretigny near Chartres.
Listen, you've got to understand, this is a very important cause.
After 8 days of discussion, the King of England was handed the territories he wanted and agreed to reduce the ransom for King John to 3 million gold écus. In return, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne. The treaty came into force in the fall of 1361. After a first installment of 400,000 gold écus was paid, Edward III finally released King John II. But that was not the end of the story. King John had to leave 3 of his sons in England until the final installment of the ransom was paid.
God bless you, my sons.
One of his sons, the 24-year-old Louis, the Duke of Anjou, escaped and ran back to France and the woman he loved. So King John was forced to return to his imprisonment in London 3 years after being set free.
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
3 months later, on April 8, 1364, King John died in the Savoy Palace. He was 45 years old. After his ancestor, the sainted King Louis, John the Good was the second monarch in the history of France to have been made prisoner. King John's remains were taken back to Paris and interred in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of the kings of France. John the Good never gave up the crown of France. His eldest son, the Dauphin Charles, succeeded him as Charles V. Despite a difficult regency, he was to become a great king. Edward had failed to snatch the French crown, but he was proud to have weakened a kingdom as rich and powerful as France. The Treaty of Bretigny deprived the kingdom of a quarter of its territory. Population was decimated. Whole villages were abandoned. France was in ruins. Its people starved and bled dry. With the death of King John II, the first phase of the 100 Years' War was nearing its end, but France was preparing for her revenge.